And joining us now, China expert Minxin of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He joins us on the line from Claremont, California, where he is a professor at Claremont McKenna College. And Minxin, it's good to have you on TVO again. How are you tonight?
Good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, and we're glad you could join us again. I want to just start by showing three graphs that are a little bit technical here, but the gist of which will become pretty simple as we go along. You can't see them, but our viewers will. Michael, if you would, let's put this up. This comes from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I guess the idea here is follow the bulge. That bulge shows that back in 1980, China had next to no middle class whatsoever, but that as you continue the look forward, what's the next graph suggest? 1995, you see the bulge is moving to the right. Incomes are rising. And if you take it one step further to the year 2008, that bulge has moved significantly to the right. So we see many more people in China with higher average incomes. This is I guess, a graphic portrait of a middle class that is emerging in the People's Republic. Now this study, Minxin, defines the middle class as those with incomes on average of $3,900 annually in terms of purchasing power. And I wonder, for starters, do you agree with that definition?
Well, that's a controversial definition. Nobody actually has a definition of what constitutes a member of the middle class that is accepted by all. But for a country like China, $3,900 in average per capita income sounds about right.
Well, if we can't put a number on it, let's see if we can put, if you like, a state of mind on it. When you talk about middle class in North America, you're talking about, you know, a house, a few bedrooms, car, maybe a vacation once a year. What does middle class look like in China?
We're talking about two steady sources of income, ownership of an apartment. We're talking primarily about urban middle class, having attained a college degree, and having some kind of savings in the bank, and also having the ability to send the only child to college.
And is the
now,
term,
of course, owning a car as well.
Oh, a car as well. Is the term middle class even used in China?
Oh, yes. The term is very popular in China. Again, as I said, the definition of the middle class in China is a subject of discussion, or if not debate.
Understood. North American middle class has a very strong sense of class identity, and I wonder whether that is the case yet in China, whether the middle class there has a strong sense of its own identity.
No, middle class in China is very diverse. So in terms of class identity, it does not exist. Middle class is mostly a concept of social status. If you've reached, if you are a member of the middle class, it simply means certain things. It means you have a certain level of income, you have a certain level of education, and you have a certain level of professional qualifications.
Let me add some numbers to this, and this comes from a piece by Cheng Li.
In terms of political values, it doesn't mean anything.
I understand. Here's a quote, because I want to put some numbers on this as well, from Cheng Li, who did a piece called The Middle Class in the Middle Kingdom. And it goes like this. In 2006, the McKinsey Global Institute made a bold prediction. China would have a total of 100 million middle-class households by 2009, which would account for 45% of the country's urban population. According to McKinsey's projections, the middle class would reach 520 million individuals, or even 612 million if lower aspirants are included, by the year 2025, accounting for 76% of the urban population. According to these estimates, China will have the world's largest middle class within 15 years. That raises a bunch of questions, so let's just start here. What role do you think the middle class plays in Chinese society today?
Well, it is certainly the most dynamic segment of Chinese society. It is the best educated, it has a lot of entrepreneurs, it is well-read, it is globally connected. So in China today, the middle class is the most important social group.
And in terms of political power, I know that when politicians are running for office here or when they give speeches here, they are constantly referring to quote-unquote working families. They constantly go after that middle-class voter. Obviously, it's different in China, but I wonder how much does keeping the middle class happy factor into decisions made by the Chinese political leadership?
It's a very important part of their political calculation because the Chinese Communist Party, which does not allow elections, that means middle class members do not vote. However, the Chinese Communist Party does listen to public opinion, and the middle class constitutes a huge part of the Chinese public. So whatever middle class thinks, the Chinese Communist Party actually feels the political pressure, even though the middle class cannot, technically speaking, throw the Communist Party out of the office.
Now, many Western political scientists, political observers are betting that the growth of the Chinese middle class will lead to increasing democratization in China. Do you think that follows as well?
Well, we're talking about a time frame. At the moment, it is not happening. The Chinese middle class is, politically speaking, very apathetic. It cares much more about having rising income, better housing, better educational opportunities, and opportunities to visit other countries as tourists. They are much less concerned about politics, but it does not mean they are not concerned about politics. In China, politics today is translated into social issues. For example, the middle class may not be too worried about human rights in the political sense, but they do care about their property rights. They care about their personal rights. They also care about their economic conditions.
Why do you think that thirst for increasing political rights has not happened yet?
Well, because after 1989, we all know what happened in China in 1989. That's when the Communist Party crushed a pro-democracy movement. The Chinese middle class decided that perhaps the best way of advancing its own interests is to engage in the economic competition, in the economic activities, rather than in political activities. For the last 20 years, we have to say, rising income levels have made the middle class relatively satisfied with their conditions. Of course, things can change very quickly. That's the principal reason. Had the economy now grown in the last 20 years, the middle class would have been a very different political animal.
So would you say that the aspirations of the middle class in China are actually aligned with the aspirations of the authoritarian government there?
No, I don't think so. I think they give the current authoritarian government contingent or conditional support. That is, as long as the current government can deliver economic growth and rising prosperity, the middle class is not going to actively engage in anti-regime activities. But once the economic conditions deteriorate, then the middle class support will disappear. That's why the Chinese government is so concerned about maintaining high levels of economic growth.
Now, if the middle class is developing and is burgeoning in size, one would have the impression that China as a society is getting more equal across all income levels. Is that in fact the case?
That's not the case. That's why I think straight line projection of the size of the middle class has to be taken with a huge grain of salt. The middle class in China is growing, but its growth depends on how income is redistributed within Chinese society. At the moment, there are very worrying trends in China that may impede the growth of the middle class. For example, in urban areas, the level of inequality is rising much faster than in rural areas. And if you have rising inequality, that means the middle will shrink. You are not going to have a society shaped like an American football with a bulging middle. You are going to have a society that increasingly looks like an Egyptian pyramid with a tiny top segment of very well-to-do people and a huge segment at the bottom of society.
And what impact do you think that is having, the pyramid versus the football, that is, on Chinese society as a whole?
I think at the moment you can sense that the level of discontent is rising in China because of disparity. And Chinese leaders are very well aware of both the rising trends in inequality and also the political consequences. Unfortunately, not much is being done to deal with the underlying causes of rising inequality in China. If the current trend continues, then forget about China having the world's largest middle class. You should really think about China as following the footsteps of Latin America. That is a very high level of social discontent, high crime rates, and chronic political instability.
All right, but having said all that, the Chinese government certainly prides itself today on having a blossoming middle class, which is increasing in size year after year after year. While we're fighting with miserable growth rates in the West, China continues to grow at 8–9% a year. How has this affected the way that China engages with the international community?
Oh, it has affected China in a very, very significant way. Let me just give you some examples. China's middle class, members of China's middle class, we're really talking about a relatively small number of upper middle class people in China. They can afford to travel to Europe, to the US, to Southeast Asia as tourists. That, of course, gives them a much better perspective on the rest of the world. They can afford to send their children for better education, higher education mostly, in the West. And they can afford to purchase expensive consumer products. They also work in Western firms in China. They may be Chinese, but they're globally connected, socially, culturally, and economically.
And let me ask you one last question about the Chinese psyche. We know that the explosive growth of the Chinese middle class has happened while the middle class in the West is considered to be in decline. And I wonder what impact the rise of the Chinese middle class coupled with the decline of the West's middle class, what impact do you think that has on the Chinese psyche?
I think at the moment it has this uplifting impact. Many Chinese believe that their day in the sun is finally here. It is the Asian century, if not the Chinese century, and they are many of them, if you believe consumer surveys, are quite optimistic. Overall, I think that bodes well for China. But we have to remember that there is a huge political hurdle ahead, that is democratization. A rising middle class and one-party dictatorship ultimately cannot coincide, but cannot coexist. So either the middle class stops growing or the one-party state disappears or goes away.
Minxin, as always, we're grateful that you could join us on TVO tonight from Claremont, California. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure.